All right, here we go. An administrative map of the world can tell you a lot of things. Boundaries, bodies of water, capitals, etc. One thing that an administrative map may not be able to provide, at least at face value, is perceived value or importance of a particular state, region, or country. What Joe Bickley will be showing you shortly is one process that compiles historical data based on military presence of the British Empire to assess as a proxy what regions of the empire considered to hold the greatest importance. That was word spaghetti. I hope that's clear. Joe will explain more. The way that this importance is visualized is very different from your run-of-the-mill cartography, far from your vanilla administrative map. And I also want to say that the work that Joe is doing here in the field of history has largely not been done that much. So this is really cool what Joe has going on, and take it away, Joe.
You know, one of the privileges of being last is you get to see how smart everybody else is, and it makes you recede and realize how silly your project is and how pointless it is, right? So, you know, I stand on the shoulders of giants and I am falling off. I'm a historian, not a GIS person, so therefore I do history, math, and I get lost in math. I understand 0 and I probably almost understand 1, right? So I look at the British Empire. And I had these slides to ask these questions about spatial theory and foundational theory and all of this stuff, and you don't want to hear any of that, right? Okay? When I started the project, Dr. Luke and Bill said, Joe, I don't want to see any of this history in your project. I don't want any of that stuff to bog it down. Just get right to the GIS, okay? So I'm going to skip some slides because I'm last on the agenda here, and I'll take too much time otherwise. And I'm going to talk about mental maps because I think mental maps are really, really cool, right? They're a way of visualizing space, right? But they're the way the individual imagines space. They're what's important to people. They're what's gets used by people. For example, this map of the world drawn by a student in Thailand is a very different understanding of space than if we go to the classroom and look at the Mercator map that's on the wall that we're all trained to believe is how the world looks, right? So this shows very different relationships. Different things are important, different things are stressed. The one next to it is a New Yorker's idea of the world, and, well, you know, hopefully nobody's from New York because I won't even begin to try and understand that one. But these maps show the way space is perceived and imagined. So if we could understand the way people perceive and imagine space, we might have an understanding as to why they view things the way they do. Why do they think certain things are important, right? As a historian, however, I can't go out and ask people. Surveys don't happen for historians. So I can't figure out how people imagine the world by asking them. I've got to sort of reverse engineer this. And Esri has this neat tool, and they're not the only ones who make the tool, but they have one that I can download and put into ArcMap, so that was good. And it lets you make cartograms, right? And the cartogram distorts spaces intentionally, right? Now the particular cartogram model that I'm using for this map, right, it distorts polygon features, colonies and countries based on a set of variables that we put in. So this one is a cartogram that is distorting the world population, and as you can see, spaces look very different. Some nations are much smaller than they are normally, and some nations are much bigger, right? But it lets you look at the world differently. My thought on this is that if I can figure out a way of determining the way people in the British Empire looked at the world, I might be able to go back and understand some of their decision-making processes or some of the reasons for the choices they make. Well, the problem is what kind of variables can model the way people imagine space. So I got to thinking about it, and I figured what's important to people. Where does my soap come from when I take a shower in the morning? Where is my son serving in the military or my family serving in the military? Where am I making my money? where is the machine that I spend all day producing going to be shipped and employed, and where is the food that comes on my table? Where does the food on my table come from, right? So I ended up looking at 3 sets of variables, right? One, of course, is the map on the wall in the school where I go, and that gave me political boundaries and relative understandings of the area of nations, right? So the foundations of how we look at our world are included in that. Then I looked at some economic variables, right? I looked at trade between nations. I looked at military deployment. I looked at capital created, right? So imports, exports, capital created, the deployment of every ship and every unit in the British Army. But these things can't just be downloaded. I had to go get them. So I spent a lot of time entering them into a spreadsheet, and I drew from original sources. And because I was concerned about information that was in circulation, I took only from public sources. So these were all published primary sources that allowed me to sort through what the world looked like. However, the world today isn't what the world was then. The boundaries are very different, the borders are very different, so I had to go and make my base map. I started with an Esri download from the world borders in 2008 because I was mostly concerned about changing only the countries that were in the British Empire or the countries that had significant relationships with the British Empire. So I got focused on maps of the British Empire, and I started putting the polygons from this 2008 map into the right places. Sometimes it was easy. Jamaica is still Jamaica. You know, it's an island, it's really good. Sometimes it was a matter of combining multiple nations. Burma, India, and Pakistan, and Bangladesh all form what was the former British colony of India, so I just joined them together, right? In Africa, it was a nightmare. So sometimes I got to divide colonies. Australia in my period was 5 colonies, not 1 nation, so I just split the country up by the states because they're the same. In Africa, I had a real nightmare because none of the borders are exactly the same. South Africa had 2 independent nations, the Orange Republic and the Transvaal State, right? Those were there, or the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic. Other colonies in Africa, the borders were completely different. So I actually had to scan these images in, georeference these maps, and then digitize all the boundaries. All right? Then I created feature classes based on the variables I described earlier, which was somewhat problematic because our cartogram engine thinks in terms of polygons, so it thinks in terms of colonies, and many of my feature classes were points. So I created feature classes with relevant information in terms of quantities so that I could, normalize the data because I only understand 0 to 1, right? And besides, how do you compare apples and oranges? Raster calculator and data normalization, right? So I created feature classes for all my variables. I then converted all those feature classes into raster layers, and I added all those rasters together so that I could get a sum total value of the world. And this was my raster. We have a problem. The raster thinks in terms of values of the individual areas or the regions, and my cartogram tool thinks in terms of polygons. So I had to use a trick that Gary Christofferson helped me figure out, which is not clipping, which I thought would work much easier than it did, but I used zonal statistics from the raster, turned them into a table, and then merged that or joined that table through to the polygon layers. Then I ran those polygons finally through the polygon generator, or through the cartogram generator. And we come up with a cartogram that I believe starts to potentially reflect the way the British imagined space in 1898, which was kind of my year, and can serve as a base map for understanding other policy questions, right? I thought, this is really cool. This is how, this looks a lot more like the Thai girls' mental map, right? So we see very different spatial relationships. Even though we've preserved distance and direction to the extent possible, we see very different spatial relationships here. Let me go back. One of these is the pointer button. The what? That wasn't. Okay. So we have very different spatial relationships here, right? Very different world. Australia seems much smaller. Canada seems to go away. The United States, which everybody in history talks about the amount of foreign investment in the United States, is really tiny, right? Africa looks pretty huge. The islands here, which are all very, very tiny nations, but they're maritime nations and deal with a lot of trade and a lot of imports and exports, so under my model, they're much larger, all right? Argentina, with a lot of British investment, is fairly much like Argentina you would expect it to be, but Brazil is completely distorted, right? Now I sandbagged this whole process, all right? I chose 1898 as my year of modeling and my year of gathering data, partly because it is right in the middle of my PhD dissertation study area, and partly because I knew in 1899 the Boer War starts in South Africa. So I wondered if there would be something special about South Africa before the Boer War started to make it seem more like an event that would be reasonable to enter into. And if we look at Cape Colony, look how big it is. Cape Colony is actually the number 3 polygon by area now in the British Empire, after India, after Britain, right? It couldn't compete with Australia as a whole because all those 5 colonies are there, but we're looking at individual colonies. So suddenly, the other thing that's interesting is this right here, are the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic. Look how large they are. There's a lot of investment. There's a lot of my variables, imports and exports, going into those places, which make them important. And a year later, we get the Boer War. So I think that gives me evidence that my process can reveal useful insights that are historically proven. Of course, the other thing that I think is very important about this map is automatically we look at it and we ask, why does that place look like it does? What's going on there? By its nature, it raises questions. It forces us to think about space in a different way. It forces us to regard that people might make different spatial choices than if they're looking at their map of Britain, their Mercator map of the British Empire on the wall, right? In this area, this area looks very different in this map than the others, so there's different choices, different things going on. This is the first step in a much larger process. I mean, my dissertation considers multiple years and adds in the variable of media saturation. However, even this map could be refined by better, more nuanced economic data. We could also look at point polygons within rasters and come up with different values. There's a lot of approaches that will make this better. At the end of the day, I hope it's an unfinished project. I hope that this makes other scholars look at it and say, hey, I'm really interested in ice cream in the British Empire, or I'm really interested in beer in the British Empire. Let's have a layer based on beer, right? Oh. So at the end of the day, I've probably accomplished nothing, but I'm a historian. I don't have to do anything. There are a lot of people that helped in this project. There's Gary Christofferson, who's still wrong about everything. John Danlow and Jen Sillis, who really went way above and beyond to make this year happen for me when life kept happening again and again and again and again, and then Gary didn't show up. Chris Lukenbiel, who took the biggest risk of all, who looked at a nut job historian and said, yeah, I'm going to let you into this GIS program and see what you do. You know, he's a visionary. Team Snowflake and the North Sal Irregulars. You know, if you don't know the north side of the Sal, you should know who you are. The rest of my cohorts, the staff and faculty of the MSGIS program, even Peter. My dissertation committee, who Gary was the representative of, and he's not here, so, I don't have to suck up that much to him. And all of the rest of you for actually staying till the end of this program. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Okay, I'm fairly sure this question that this planted comes from a happy, good place, but are you stupid?
Yes. I already opened up with I'm the dumbest guy in the room. Okay, so, I should think that you might now have eclipsed me because I admitted at the beginning. I know, you're just ventriloquizing Gary, so. Any other questions?
Yeah, let's chat for a second.
Okay.
The first thing I'm thinking about is when you're dealing with mental maps, and if you think of Kevin Lynch's classic standardization,
Right.
and the works that's come out of behavioral geometry since, you're talking about appraised and designated maps. And I think one of the things that might really help literature theoretically, or even the way that you're working, is that you're actually dealing with designated maps,
Right.
in a very concrete way, but cartograms are valued by area.
Right. Well, I think area is one of the important variables.
No.
Right.
But appraised maps are they're giving valuation to area.
Right.
So I just wanted you to know, or to think about, and maybe critically think about it when you're reviewing your dissertation, that you're showing a way that a designated map can be an appraisal of space in a very unique way.
That's absolutely what I want to do.
Yeah.
Is because I think that the appraisal map, if we start with like critical geography, and then we engage with this idea of spatial relations, this is all the boring stuff I skipped over at the first part, right? If we engage with spatial relationships, right, very often critical geographers divorce themselves from the fact that a whole lot of area means a whole lot of stuff when we imagine the map. Whether it happens because we look at the Mercator map, or whether it happens because we have to walk from here to Tucson, right? That distance is very much a part of the spatial imagination. And sometimes, sort of Lefebvre and the theoretical line that goes away from that sort of loses sight that, there's a there. I've sat in a history class and had a professor tell me that all science was created. And that it was all service of the capitalism and it was all a paradigm and all of this stuff. And I looked at him and said, if I start walking from here to San Diego and don't die of exposure, it's going to take me 30 days, if you call it a googolplex, a mile, a kilometer, or, a nano joint. That doesn't matter. There's a reality there.
That was the first point, but dealing with the cartogram and the middle map, I kind of felt like I kept thinking about Frederick Jameson.
Right.
Cognitive maps of the world.
Right.
But within that, I guess, like Jameson's been highly criticized, the map of territory.
Right.
But if you can put valuation to, a
Right.
critical theory of mapping an empire,
That's what I'm trying to do.
that's pretty damn powerful.
Right, because you end up here, I was figuring out how to value and quantify particular things, right?
Yeah.
And and there's an opening on my committee, by the way. My thinking was how do you quantify this stuff? And so one of my big things that is in my dissertation is media. And the way I approached the media saturation was by not looking at the content of the image, but is by looking at the quantity of the image in terms of where it's represented to have been from. So I can put lots of dots on the map and see, then pull those into those polygons. And again, we're getting at the same idea. It's how do I navigate that?
No, you're doing good work. Yeah. I really appreciate you.
And then it's the other question that everybody asks is the nightmare question I have is how do you weight the variables? I don't know yet. That's why I have a dissertation. All right.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
If you go back to your final map,
Uh-huh.
I was most curious. This is just a complete guess, but I thought Britain was going to be even bigger. I know it's bigger than normal, but I thought it was going to be
Okay.
really
One reason for that is I use normalized values instead of actual values. If I had used actual values of, imports and exports, Britain would have dominated the map in a way that was huge. And the reality is I'm aware that that's the expectation, but I'm really interested in seeing how Britain looks out at the world. So a dominant Britain wasn't useful. So I just largely, when it became relevant, I assigned Britain a value of 2 constantly. So it's always the biggest thing on the map, right? In a normalized map of 0 to 1, I made it a 2. So it will always be distorted in the biggest way possible. However, the relationship to the other colonies is really what I'm interested in. I mean, India is predictably number 2 on the chart, but by how much and how much it is kind of intriguing. And Chris's comments, Dr. Lukenbill's comments here, raised the interesting speculation of, since we know the area of the new polygons, we could actually subtract the area of the original polygon from the new polygon and understand which areas are changing the most. So, yeah.
Could you go back to your variables?
I have 2 variable slides. You want to know my sources or my variables?
No, it's in
That one. Yeah, this is my data. So these are my sources.
So your military, by having a regiment somewhere, you're saying what?
I'm saying that there's a dot on the map that represents people experienced that. It is 2 things. One, it is an accounting of political power. We care enough about the area around this regiment to put one there. Secondly, there's an experiential quality to it, right? People have been there, right? People's sons have been there. People's neighbors have been there, right? People can identify that as a spot. And actually, I could even break it down by whether it was a Guards regiment, whether it's an artillery battery, whether it's a native regiment, whether it's an Indian regiment. We can have a deep discussion about the different shadings of the, no.
I get it.
So it does 2 things. Almost all of my variables I use in a couple ways. One, they're actual numbers, but things like imports and exports, those also represent like soap or cotton or other products in the stream of commerce. So it's raw money, but it's also variables.
The reason I ask that is because you run the risk of doubling up on a variable there. Because one doesn't
Yes.
send the military someplace unless there's an economic, political, or diplomatic reason.
Absolutely.
So if you're already including economic up there, you might want to be careful.
What? Well,
Why you said politics, because that's ultimately
yes. And there's a lot of economics and a lot of military politics. But for me, the important things about the variable are that it makes it more prominent in the minds of the people. So doubling up on the variable is a reflection of the fact that they have 2 reasons to care about that, right? So the locations where the military are going to be are interesting. Although, oddly enough, the South Africa one doesn't reflect the military buildup of the Boer War at all. That was pretty much standard garrisoning.
But it nicely gives a spatial location for political or policy.
Right. And the reality is the other thing I can do with those regiments is if I can, somehow model force deterioration over space, I could actually put a buffer around each one of them in Euclidean distance and break it down by degradation and call it where were they able to project their power. With the naval ships, I did tons. I did ship tons because that's a convenient measure of naval strength, right? Sure. All right.